A cell, very modestly, does exchange information with its environment. So I would argue that at a very, very minimal level, a cell might have a trace in qualia space, which means that there is some form of consciousness there. So one of the wild things about this qualia dimension idea is that the qualia dimension and the path that we carve through this qualia dimension is associated with the same thing as what happens if you move through time. The information that, well, it's kind of leaking from my brain as my brain jumping from one place to the other place in consciousness space. But information ends up in the random processes of the number generator, making it left random. From that final moment, information is being spread back into time. Could it be that we pick up information from that final thought at the end of the universe in our lives today?
Welcome to the Quantum Theory Podcast.
Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to the Quantum Theory Podcast. Super excited to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Fantastic. Well, I always love to start these conversations off by just giving the audience a little bit of background and context into your research and your general career within the field. So if you don't mind just giving us a quick little origin story of maybe where these interests started for you and your entrance into the field of neuroscience and studies in psychology to how you wandered into the no man's land of studying consciousness. If you don't mind just giving us a little bit of an origin story there.
Oh, well, that's actually a pretty long story. Unfortunately, my book is not out in English, but I detail it there quite some detail. So basically, my origin story started when I was about 6 years old. And I'm not sure if you recognize this phenomenon, but if you stare into a mirror, you sometimes get this eerie feeling like it's something wrong with the image that I'm seeing over here. So when I was about 6 years old, my mom sent me to the bathroom to brush my teeth and get ready for bed. And I found myself staring into the mirror whilst I was brushing my teeth. And there I got this really, really weird sensation that something's off. Something's not right over here. So this question popped into my mind. Am I real or is the guy in the mirror real? What actually is reality? And that was at 6 years old. So until then, I wanted to become a police officer. And after that particular moment, which was almost a kind of mystic experience, I knew I wanted to become a scientist. No matter what, I want to become a scientist. So now I know that phenomenon is actually quite normal. It's called the mirror illusion. And you can quite easily evoke it yourself by just staring into a mirror. It has to do with the fact that the fusiform phase area, part of the brain that detects faces, actually gets tired if you stare at faces for too long, and it gets all these kinds of weird distortions in perception. But you don't know that if you're 6 years old and staring into a mirror. So that really sort of brought on this interest in the question, what is reality? Who am I? What am I doing in this place? So from that moment on, I knew I wanted to become a scientist. And my father was a pretty big science fiction fan. So from age 8, 10-ish, he let me watch Star Trek. And that really captured the imagination. This is sort of the next generation era with Data, the conscious android. And I was completely captivated by that. So I had this brief bout that I wanted to study astronomy. And I actually wanted to do that for quite a while, so astronomy and or physics, until I was about 16 years old. And in the Dutch school system, you have to select your curriculum, and that curriculum prepares you for university. So in order to study physics and astronomy, you need to have calculus in your curriculum. I really did not like calculus, and for a rather childish reason, and that is that I actually had to do quite a bit of work for that. And when I was around 14 or 15 years old, I started playing bass, and I was not really that much of a unruly teenager, but my main act of rebellion as a teenager was dropping calculus from my curriculum and deciding that I wanted to become a rock star. So I had this brief period of about 2 years in which I was absolutely devoted to going to music school. Actually turns out that you have to have some talent for that, which I lacked, unfortunately. So I had to come up with plan B. And I still had this interest well, data, the conscious android, never really sort of got away from me. And this fascination with consciousness and with the human mind still was with me. So I decided, okay, I dropped calculus. I cut off the route to physics and astronomy, but I can still do artificial intelligence, which was when I was about 18 years old, uh, really in its infancy. And you just had the first of academic studies in artificial intelligence in their own right in the Netherlands. Um, so I was rather impulsive and I decided, okay, I'm just going to study that and don't care about the rest. And I already know what I want. I don't have to go look at that. Until my parents said, no, if you want to go study and if you want to go, and I wanted to study in Amsterdam, of course. If you want to go move to Amsterdam, then you have to look at that study and really need to be sure that that is where you want to study and that is what you want to do. And actually turned out that AI at that time really didn't have anything to do with building conscious robots, really didn't have anything to do with building data. It had to do with creating a robot that could follow a line. And it was about the most boring thing I had ever been to. So this was kind of the moment that, okay, plan A, physics, plan B, music school failed as well. Now plan C, AI, okay, that doesn't go through either. And I'm not sure if you have this in the US as well, but in the Netherlands, we have this joke, if you don't know what you want to study, you go study psychology. And this was actually kind of the same for me. But there's actually a deeper reason behind that, and that is that in music school, I had learned a little bit about cognitive psychology. I knew that in physics, there were some people working on cognition. I knew that in AI, cognitive psychology was actually a theme, and I thought, hey, that's quite interesting. There appears to be some red line, something that is in all these different disciplines. Maybe I should have a serious look at this cognitive psychology, whatever it may be. So I was fresh out of high school. All my other plans had not materialized, and I decided, okay, I'm going to go to Amsterdam and study psychology, which I absolutely hated for the first year. For the reason, and this is actually quite interesting. I'm not sure if you or your audience knows this, but psychology is actually it's supposed to be the science of the mind, psyche or psyche in Greek. It actually means mind, but it's not about the mind. Psychology is the study of human behavior and what causes us to do the way we do. And I started my studies in 1997. And when I taught my my mentor, psychology in the Netherlands is a rather big study. My cohort, when I started, was about 350 students. That was considered a large study in the Netherlands. Nowadays, that is sort of in a small area. Most psychology cohorts that start now in the Netherlands are around 600-700 students, I guess. But we all had assigned a mentor. And when I talked to my mentor about my interest in consciousness, he pretty much said, yeah, that's not really a thing psychologists study. And that was a bit painful, of course, for several reasons. I was in my first year and I was being taught this idea that mind is what the brain does, and consciousness is not something that psychologists study. Well, while I was at high school, I was really getting interested in, for example, reading with Carl Jung and reading about parapsychology. So when I started studying psychology, I thought, oh, this is really cool. Now I'm going to be a psychologist. I can go into the university library, read all this stuff about parapsychology and all this stuff I did not really know about. It's the first in my family to actually go to university. So I had
very cool.
My idea about university was kind of Hogwarts, you know. This place where you have all this hidden knowledge that mere mortals can't access. Well,
right.
Turned out to be less exciting than that, but nonetheless pretty cool in the end. But all the stuff that I thought that I was going to learn about consciousness, about the mind, about all these different areas where I practice cognitive psychology bit coming together, learning about parapsychology, not so in the first year of academic psychology at the University of Amsterdam. Psychology is an actual science where we focus on things that we can measure. And you can't really measure a Bose-Einstein condensate, which I had read somewhere to be a correlative consciousness in the brain. We don't do parapsychology because that's hogwash, and we all know that. And we're definitely going to not look at quantum theory because no, period. So that was a pretty rough start because all this stuff that you're interested in, and probably your audience is interested in as well. So all these things about Eastern philosophy, all this wisdom that's contained in the world's literature, all these links between the human mind and nature that quantum theorists well, pretty much all of them in the early 1930s, from Schrödinger to Heisenberg to Einstein himself actually saw. Nothing of that. Psychology kind of looked like pretty much the wrong exit. I actually studied physics for a while. I studied English literature for a while. I studied sociology, science journalism to find something where I could actually find all these things that I did like. But in the end, it actually turned out that psychology wasn't such a bad choice after all. So my first year of psychology was kind of rough awakening. Okay, in academia, all these different things that I'm so interested in are not really being studied. And if they are studied, they're not really being taken seriously by the mainstream. But it actually turned out that there were a couple of people who did study consciousness and who did look at consciousness from a perspective that I found really interesting. So pretty much the person who kind of kept me within psychology is Dick Bierman. At the time, he was a professor of parapsychology, actually, and I can tell for hours about that particular topic. But parapsychology is an area of psychology that deals with stuff that we can't explain: telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, stuff like that. Actually, parapsychology is a pretty old branch of psychology. So psychology as a science itself has its roots in the late 19th century. And if you look at the first parapsychologists, William James is one of the most important ones. One of the things that these early psychologists were very interested in is in the question whether the human soul can survive death. So the idea that the spirit can live on in a kind of afterlife. And in the early 19th century and early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, this was actually a pretty big thing. So you had all these kind of spiritists, mediums, people claiming to be able to communicate with the dead. There was a lot of scientific research into that area. So parapsychology was actually one of the main branches of psychology when it all started out. Well, unfortunately, that kind of died out rather quickly. But a few pockets remained, and one of the people I got to know in Amsterdam, Dick Bierman, was one of the last people in the Netherlands actually studying parapsychological phenomena from a scientific perspective. And he took me on. I became his student, and that is actually what
Oh, wow.
made me stay in psychology. And if you look at sort of the study of consciousness, well, nowadays we have cognitive neuroscience of consciousness popping up everywhere, and you can't really open an edition of Science or Nature, and you have some cool neuroimaging studies telling you about which brain areas correlate with consciousness. You've got psychopharmacological studies. I didn't know what, but about 25 years ago, it's quite a bit of a different story. So the academic or psychological study of consciousness really started to take off around the moment that I started my undergraduate studies. And I was fortunate enough that at the same time I was starting my undergraduate studies, a guy in Amsterdam was also starting up his laboratory, Victor Lamme, pretty famous neuroscientist. And Dick Bierman, the parapsychologist and my mentor, did not really have a position to continue my academic career. So I did my undergraduate studies with him. But when it got time to move on to a PhD position, it was quite difficult because there are no funded PhD positions in parapsychology in the Netherlands.
Sure.
So I had to look elsewhere. And it actually turned out that Victor Lange, who was doing some really interesting stuff on consciousness and was really starting to venture into human studies. He has done a lot of work with macaque monkeys. And he was really starting to get into human studies using all kinds of pretty cool neuroimaging stuff, fMRI, EEG, the brainwave studies. And really cool, he was starting up a TMS lab, and TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a technique to basically generate an extremely strong magnetic field, but for a very, very short period of time. And that kind of messes up your brain for a very brief while. And that gives you the possibility to mimic certain brain lesions in people. And that's pretty cool if you're interested in studying the effects of brain lesions on perception and consciousness. So I knew Victor was looking for an intern. So I did my internship with him, and he then asked me to stay on as his PhD student. And that was quite cool. So I had a PhD position in consciousness science now, in a time, an era where that was nigh impossible in the Netherlands. So I was very, very lucky to be at the right time at the right place. Slight downside of it all was that Victor was a very, very strongly physicalist slash materialist guy. So you don't really get more to mind is what the brain does than Victor Lange. So here we are. I was a PhD student with an interest in consciousness, with a pretty broad interest in also the more esoterical perspective in consciousness, being trained by one of the last parapsychologists in the Netherlands, and now doing my PhD in pretty much the most physicalist materialist lab you could find anywhere in the world. And that led to a rather interesting combination and a research career. I won't bore you and the audience with my entire research career, but I did quite a lot of stuff. I did a postdoc in Switzerland, spent a while in the UK as assistant professor, and then moved back to the Netherlands, where I ran my own lab for about 10, 15 years in Groningen, which is a tiny city in the north of the Netherlands. And I have been studying consciousness broadly ever since. So I've done a lot of empirical work, a lot of theoretical work. But I also think it's good to know for you and for the audience that I am no longer, I'm still working for the universities, but then as a whole. You can imagine that for a guy with my kinds of interests, the research grants are not really that it's not that easy to get research grants. And one of the things that you need, one of the things that you need in order to get a professorship in the Netherlands is that you have a steady research income. So in the Netherlands, we have a rather strict division between assistant professors, associate professors, and full professors. And I actually made it to associate professor. But if you want to have some kind of management position within university, which I find kind of interesting to see, well, can I lead a team, for example? Then you actually have to have the full professor position, which in my case would be rather difficult to obtain because it requires about, I think, 1 to 2 million euros in grant income accumulated over 5 years. Well, the larger the grant you can get in parapsychology is 40,000 euros. So you need a lot of these in order to get your full professorship. Plus, I'm a really crappy PhD supervisor, so I decided it would be better that I tried my luck elsewhere. And I could get a very cool position as department head for the research policy and support department, which sounds not that particularly exciting, but actually is. So I was the director of all the laboratories at my psychology department for a couple of years. Then I spent another year doing some really theoretical research, and then I decided that I really liked to do sort of the combination of research, but also some management and stuff that has to do with policy and politics. So I got a really cool opportunity to get a job for the University Association, and that's where I work now. I'm the Director of Research and Impact for the Dutch University Association.
Very cool.
Which basically represents all Dutch universities, and it really gets me in weird places. So that's a completely different story all on by itself. But I'm sort of a policy director by day, researcher by night. That's my career thus far.
Wow. Thank you for the full narrative. It's always interesting to hear all the twists and turns and, how you just landed in the area of interest that you are now. And I think that sets the stage for several different threads that I want to go down, kind of getting to more of the brass tacks of consciousness and your theories in regards to panpsychism and things along those lines. So I think just starting with definitions for the audience in this context for you, how would you define consciousness within your framework or within the broader framework of panpsychism?
For me, consciousness is pretty much related to experience itself. And that's something that I've taken from my work with Lama. In order to get sort of a grip on consciousness, you really need to have a narrow definition. So conscious can mean a lot of things for different people, but the definition that we used in the labs I worked in, I still use to this day, is raw experience. So it's the feeling that is associated with seeing the color blue, for example. So we're leaving out all the connotation with intelligence or with language or with emotion. It's really the raw. What does it feel like to see the color blue? What does it feel like to experience pain? So it's experiences. That's the core of the definition of consciousness for me that I'm working on. I'm trying to understand how this relation between activity in my brain and these experiences, how that works. And that's for me the core question.
Understood. And I think a good delineation to make as well is how would you stack your perspective of panpsychism up against, let's say, Goff's traditional model of panpsychism that, if I have this correctly, that virtually everything is conscious within space-time, and yours is coming from more of an angle of consciousness or qualia space is a dimension in and of itself.
Yeah. I actually, it's not completely my own idea. Actually, it's not my own idea at all. Let me put that for starters. The idea of qualia space is actually one of the older ideas that's floating around in conscious theories. It dates back to the late 1990s when it actually was formalized by Richard Stanley. And the idea is actually a rather extreme version of psychophysics. And psychophysics dates back even longer. It's a branch of psychology that actually predates psychology itself. Psychophysics deals with the study of how physical stimuli relate to sensations. So I told you earlier that I'm a musician, I play bass, and one of the big frustrations for a bass player is that whereas a guitar player can bring a 50-watt amp and still make a lot of noise, I need to drag in a 300 watts amp in order to make the same amount of noise. So that's a bit weird. Physically speaking, the same amount of energy is going into the sensory system, but the physical sensation is completely different. Now, psychophysics deals with that particular question. How do physical stimuli relate to particular sensations? And guys like Gustav Fechner and Ernst Weber, Germans who were doing this kind of work already in the early 1800s, actually have worked quite meticulously on mapping out the relation between physical stimuli and the actual sensations. And that actually gave birth to an entire branch of psychology that we still have to date, which is called psychophysics. And the idea of qualia space is actually sort of the extreme formalization of psychophysics in its broadest sense. So in the late 1990s, we have this mathematician, Richard Stanley, who was interested in sort of this relation between how one sensation can morph into another. You can imagine that if I perceive the color blue, it's pretty easily imaginable how that can morph into the sensation of the color green. We can actually trace a direct line from blue to green in our mind's eye. But Stanley asked himself the question, okay, but if I can draw a line from green to blue to, let's say, purple to red, can I take that line and then move it from red to the sensation of warmth. And from the sensation of warmth to actually feeling pain. And from feeling pain to the feeling of stubbing my right toe. And he actually came up with a model, which he called the Qualia space model, that actually quite nicely describes how you can map out conscious experiences in a kind of high dimensional space. And he really thought of this as a kind of mathematical exercise. He also had this idea that, okay, maybe we can someday use this model in order to map physical systems on this consciousness space, but he really didn't think of it as an actual physical space. Now, fast forward a bit to the early 2000s, we got a guy whom you probably know, Giulio Tononi, who came up with a pretty interesting model called the integrated information theory. And the integrated information theory is a rather controversial theory, which states that particular modes of information processing in information processing systems, like your computer, your smartphone, but of course it's all about the brain as an information processing system, how specific modes of information processing can lead to consciousness. And basically, the idea of Tononi, IIT, is based on this Qualia space model by Stanley. So basically, Tononi presents his IIT, its integrated information theory, as kind of a linking pin between what's going on in an information processing physical system and how does that information processing map on this Qualia space. When I was doing my PhD and starting up my own research line, IT was an interesting curiosity. In Lam's laboratory, we were more or less working on a concurrent theory, the recurrent processing theory. And we thought all this integrated information stuff was overly complicated. To a large extent, I think that was because we actually felt it indeed was overly complicated. But to some extent also because we simply did not understand it. It's rather complicated information theoretical formula and stuff like that. Nonetheless, we have several theories that try to incorporate these qualia space ideas into theories that describe something about a physical system and how it maps onto such a qualia space. Now, a couple of years ago, I actually let that idea rest. I wasn't really concerned with these kinds of theories. I was far more working on the idea that consciousness might be either a brain process or that it might be something different altogether. I've been doing quite a bit of work on the consciousness causes collapse theory. So the idea in quantum theory that a conscious observation, that is the thing that makes the wave function collapse. I've spent quite a few years working on those experiments trying to show that. Never really succeeded, by the way, but I'll get to that in a bit. Until in 2019, I was at a conference for the Parapsychological Association. And those are really fun conferences. They're small, they're with the same crowd, and they're really, really clever people working there. So parapsychology has a very bad rap. And there are some, let me put it mildly, interesting figures in that area. But there are also extremely, extremely clever people of whom I learned a great deal. And one of those people is Bernard Carr, British cosmologist. And he has written quite extensively about the idea that consciousness can actually be a higher dimension of reality. He writes about this in terms as a physicist would do, or cosmologist would do. So with a rather different conception of what consciousness means than my rather limited definition. But we actually had a very, very interesting conversation at dinner at the PA convention. And that is where actually the idea that consciousness could be a dimension of reality sort of took hold in the back of my mind. And in the months after that, I sort of started working and elaborating on that idea. And then at a given moment, it struck that, hey, this is actually, if we think about this dimension not as something mystical or weird or something that we can't explain, but something that we already have described in literature, namely Stanley's Qualia space, then it all fits together. So I worked on that theory in several iterations. I'm now working on a revised version of a paper that's out in Archive, which you can read. It's called The Higher Dimensions of Consciousness. And if the readership is interested, you can quite easily access that. It's open access, and you can read that for free. But the idea is this. It is a panpsychist model in the sense that it states that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the universe. However, it does not mean that everything is conscious.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the model states that the physical reality that we live in is real. We still take physics for what it is at face value. We say that all physical laws, all physical constants that we have, they're still in place. We simply extend them with a Qualia space, a space that contains all the possible experiences that are there. So it means that I claim that my conscious experiences has a real status in the universe. They're as real as photons, electrons, as protons, as the matter that we're made of. They're not an epiphenomenon of matter. They actually exist independently of matter. They exist in this dimension of Qualia space. And now the difficult or the tricky thing here is that these experiences exist does not mean that we experience them all at the same time. They exist as what you might call proto-qualia. And even that is a borrowed term because Bertrand Russell, great philosopher of the early 20th century, already had a rather similar idea, namely that consciousness exists as a sort of a seed, a potentiality in the universe. So conscious experiences exist as proto-qualia. And if you have the right configuration of these proto-qualia together with a material system, then the system actually experiences that particular experience that's stored in this Qualia space. Now, that's pretty much also what my model says. Basically, what I'm saying is that if we have a physical description of a particle moving through space, we can write that down in the wave function in quantum mechanics, and we describe x, a y, a z, a t for time, and that gives us in sort of quantum mechanics the probability that we will find a particle at a given space. And then for the critical listener, yes, I know you have to take the absolute and then the square of the wave function. But what I'm saying is you have to extend those x, y, z, and t with an additional coordinate q. And that q is the position in this Qualia space. And that sounds like a rather silly thing to do, extending physics with an endless realm of Qualia. But it actually makes a lot of sense when you start thinking of it. There's a lot of stuff that you can all of a sudden explain if you include this additional dimension of Qualia. One thing that you can't explain, and which is the big Achilles heel of the theory, is that where do these Qualia come from? I haven't got a clue.
Sure.
And that's pretty much the weak point in the theory. I'm inventing a completely new dimension. But nonetheless, this theory has a very, very elegant thing to it, and that is that you can actually empirically test it. And that is one of the things that I'm still doing at the moment. So one of the refinements I'm working on right now, you can't really add an additional dimension into physics without seriously disturbing stuff. So there's all kinds of stuff that you have to think about. I can't just add in an additional coordinate in the wave function without getting into trouble with stuff like classical
like thermodynamics.
Thermodynamics is one thing. You also mess with general relativity if you're not careful.
Pretty important.
Yeah, exactly. So it needs a bit of work and refinement, and that is sort of what I'm presently working as. So
Okay.
one of the interesting things is what does this additional dimension or additional Qualia space actually add? And one of the weird things that you can demonstrate is that if this Qualia space actually exists, and if it exists as a dimension through which particles that we are made up out of move through, um, you expect interactions between systems exclusively in this Qualia space. And that is something that you can empirically verify whether that happens or not. And this is where sort of my background in parapsychology actually comes in, because a lot of stuff that we find weird and that we find impossible in parapsychology all of a sudden becomes extremely trivial if you include this additional dimension. And that's sort of where the idea originated, because Bernard Carr and I were thinking about, okay, this higher dimension model of Carr, how does it explain paranormal phenomena? And that sort of one struck me, hey, this also has something to do with the hard problem of consciousness. And I took these two together, and it actually resulted in a model that made sense to me. Now, my interesting challenge is to see if it also makes sense to other people.
Sure.
But yeah, that's the big difference with sort of Goff's panpsychism, which states that all things that we see. So basically, in Goff's panpsychism, the observables in the universe are the consequence of interacting conscious agents. Consciousness is actually the fundamental of everything that's there. My theory is a lot more modest in a way, because it says, well, physics, all that we know of physics is true. We just have to extend it a little bit with all possible experiences that can exist. But if we add those in, we can pretty much explain a lot of stuff.
It's like pick your poison. You either add a dimension or the entire physical universe is made of consciousness.
Exactly. No, but the interesting thing is, if you look at logical analysis, and Keith Frankish, who's a pretty interesting materialist philosopher, has wrote a very nice and insightful paper about this. We have this intuitive idea that consciousness is something that our brain produces, or something that exists or can exist independent of our brain. And that is pretty fascinating, because if you assume that consciousness is something that is real, you have to end up with a model, with a metaphysical model, in which these conscious experiences actually have an ontological place. And with that, I mean that they can exist independently of the brain. So my experience of the color blue is something fundamentally different than brain cells or retinal cells firing at a certain frequency or interacting at a particular mode. And Frankish, being a materialist, said, well, we have to let go of the notion that conscious experience can exist as independent things, because if we start to think about conscious experiences as stuff that exists independently of matter, then we end up with a panpsychist model or something like that. And I happen to like that analysis and agree with it. Only contrary to Frankish, I think that conscious experiences actually exist. So it's not a completely wild idea to end up with a panpsychist model, whether it's Goff's or whether it's the Qualia space model or whether it's this weird Qualia dimension model that I'm advocating.
So I'd like to just. Oh, I'm sorry. Continue.
No.
Oh, sure.
Just trying to make the right point, but.
No, it's perfect. I think we're going in the same direction, because I'd love to drill a little bit further into Qualia space just to get some more intuition around it. And I think one of the questions that anyone would ask about any panpsychist theory, so is an atom conscious, is a cell conscious, and so in your Qualia space version of that, are there Qualia associated with the life of a cell? Does a cell move through its own version of Qualia space? Because a cell, I would presume, wouldn't be able to have or pass through the Qualia space relating to seeing a basketball, like let's say we would. So how would you approach that?
No, I think you're exactly hitting the nail on its head. We all have our own particular tracks of qualia space. So in my model, qualia space is what we call topologically organized, which means that qualia are at the same or roughly at the same space in this large dimension. So the interesting thing is, even though we're quite far apart, physically speaking, we are now quite close together within this qualia space because we share certain of our qualia. We share experiences. We are quite close together now, and closer than we were half an hour ago or an hour ago when we were still doing our own stuff. A cell, the honest answer is I don't know if a cell has consciousness. I don't know if it has a particular track in qualia space that will qualify as conscious. Now, in Stanley's original model, and I kind of borrowed that from Stanley as well, Stanley states that there is a ground state in qualia space in which there is no consciousness. And a lot of this has to do with information exchange with the environment. In my model, the concept of information exchange with the environment is pretty vital. That's an aspect I'm working on at the moment. Kind of borrowing from a lot of the modern theoretical stuff in cognitive neuroscience. So IT is one example, but we also have the free energy principle by Friston, which is a very influential theory on information exchange between systems and their environment. The exchange of information is central. Now, one of the things that I think is a cornerstone for movement through qualia space is information exchange with the environment. So systems that exchange or process information are systems that can, in theory, move through a trace in qualia space. A cell, very modestly, does exchange information with its environment. So I would argue that at a very, very minimal level, a cell might have a trace in qualia space, which means that there is some form of consciousness there. A rock, on the other hand, no.
Got it. And even further, when it comes to the qualia space and the contents of qualia space, maybe this gets into a bit of teleology, which perhaps you maybe not want to touch, but I would presume the qualia of, in this same instance, seeing a basketball was not possible before a basketball was invented. So how do the contents, is it sort of a probabilistic sort of quantum phenomena where all these possibilities exist and sort of we manifest those within the three-dimensional space-time and have those types of qualia or qualitative experiences? Do you have any intuition around sort of what the contents of qualia space are?
Oh, that's a very interesting and actually difficult one. I do think it's probabilistic. Or actually, I'm quite sure it is probabilistic because otherwise it wouldn't work. I would argue that qualia space, I'm getting on a slippery slope here, but I do think that this is the only way we can actually make some sense of this. I think that qualia space might represent all possible experiences given the laws of physics that started around the Big Bang, which means that theoretically there should also be qualia for highly intelligent dinosaurs. And these qualia exist, or proto-qualia exist, but since we had the mass extinction event 65 million years ago, there is no matter that can go there. So that's a part of qualia space, which is sort of now locked out of our physical, the realms of physical possibility. But the asteroid that missed Earth 65 million years ago, then the qualia space that we're occupying, or that's sort of the proto-qualia that we are, would have been sort of part of qualia space that universe would have never moved into. So I think that the possibilities of qualia space are literally endless. So in a sense, I think that what's the name of the movie again? Everything Everywhere All at Once. That is actually sort of what you have in the many worlds model of Everett every quantum decision splits off in a different universe. All the possibilities that you have in such a multiverse are already contained within the laws of physics that started out with the Big Bang. I think the quality of space is rather similar. It is pretty much an endless canvas of possible qualia, but the path that the universe actually follows through qualia space is the one set by the actual events happening. Now, in order to make this work, and in order to, and here we get a bit into sort of what kind of model do you like, it is perfectly compatible with many worlds in a sense. So suppose that one of the big questions in many worlds is what happens with our consciousness after a new quantum decision. Does it mean that one of the cool things about the many worlds hypothesis is that we can rather easily conceptualize this or try to get an idea about this. There's this really cool app on iOS, the Multiverse Splitter. It is an app that you can press the button, then a quantum number generator somewhere in Switzerland generates a random bit, a 0 or a 1. But given that it's in superposition, if many worlds is true, it splits off two universes, one in which the bit was 1 and one in which the bit was 0. And the idea behind the universe splitter is that, okay, if you have difficulty with taking a decision, don't take it. Just imagine that if the universe splitter says 1, then you go for alternative A. For example, you take a chocolate ice cream. And if the universe splitter says B, then you take your vanilla ice cream. You don't have to choose, because as long as you stick with 1 is the chocolate ice cream, in the other universe that splits off, you're taking the vanilla ice cream. So you're getting it both ways. Now, the difficulty, of course, is our experience only goes one way. So how come that we don't experience the other universe? Now, the qualia model, the qualia space model, if indeed these qualia are endless, it's pretty simple. One universe takes this path in qualia space. The other one takes the vanilla ice cream pathway in space. And they both exist at the same time. Now, the difficulty with that model is that literally everything happens at the same time, and there is no real dynamic in there. So you were talking about teleology. In a universe where everything happens at the same time and in which everything is real, in the end, well, nothing happens, because it's a static universe in which actually nothing happens. So one alternative is by not going for the many worlds model, but by going for kind of alternatives. So instead of assuming that when I do this universe splitter, we have two parallel universes, we could actually say, I don't think that a quantum wave collapse is associated with branching off two universes. I actually say the wave function collapse is real, but it happens independent of conscious observation, because conscious observation is now part of the universe. That's one of the weird things of my theory. If I mentioned a while ago that I have been working on consciousness causes collapse experiments for quite a while, never really have been able to find any, well, I did find evidence for that particular hypothesis, but just as in parapsychological experiments, there was a very strong decline effect. So in the end, very, very tiny significant effect, but not really something that I could send to the Nobel Committee. But if you think about consciousness as being a higher universe, of a higher dimension of the universe, and consciousness being a fundamental aspect of the universe, it all of a sudden gets a bit weird if a particular coordinate in the wave function causes it to collapse. That doesn't really work. So if you go for this particular model, then consciousness causes collapses out of the window, and you have to come with a kind of subject-independent version of wave function collapse. And we actually have quite a few of those. So one of the more interesting in this particular context is the Gerhard Rimini Weber models, or GRW. They are models that
Objective
have
collapse.
they're objective collapse models indeed. One of the nice things of these GRW models is that they are compatible with general relativity. So if you want to keep your physics intact, as I prefer, then it would actually come down to this, that we have kind of cosmic clock that ticks, that we have frames during which wave functions collapse and all entangled systems collapse as well, and really freeze the universe in one instant of time within qualia space, and that then is what we experience. So my brain is a system that's highly entangled. According to GRW, the probability of a single particle in my brain collapsing about once every 10,000 years, but because my brain is made up out of such a large number of particles, and all of these particles are probably entangled because of the amount of interactions that they have with each other, roughly every, I believe it's in the order of nanoseconds, my brain would be fixated at a particular place in physical space, but also in qualia space. So that actually gives me a moment at which I have a real experience, and that's sort of what creates reality. Now, of course, there are different models. You have a lot of other objective reduction models. Quantum gravity is one, and then, of course, orchestrated objective reduction. Probably you and your audience is aware of Stu Hameroff's and Roger Penrose's objective orchestrated objective reduction, which actually would also fit really well with this particular idea of qualia space. So there are different other candidate models there, but I think that is an interesting alternative if you don't want to go for the idea that everything happens all at once and all at the same time, but that actually the physical universe carves a path through qualia space, and that the possibility for conscious experience is literally endless. It's basically what our physical universe moves through.
That reminds me of, I don't know if you've looked much into this, but Stephen Wolfram's work in the Physics Project with hypergraphs and sort of it's far too complex for myself to put it down very clearly, but really there's sort of a general sort of rule set, and I guess in the most basic terms, we're kind of getting carving a slice out of this overall sort of hyper complex system, and it gives a little flavor of kind of what you're saying. We're carving this path through this qualia space, and that gets to another point as well, which is the temporal aspect of qualia space. And I promise I'll put qualia space down in a moment and we'll move on. But just getting an idea there, because I know when I was reading your papers, you're discussing how it could not necessarily be spatial, but temporal, and that's how we sort of correlate it with information. And that's how we kind of bring it into this picture. I'd love to hear that directly from yourself, kind of how you conceptualize that and how that fits into this.
Well, very briefly put, if you look at the dimensions that we have in normal space-time, we have the XYZ dimensions. And one of the fascinating things about the XYZ dimensions is that we have free movement through those. I can return to a place where I was before in XYZ space. However, we also move through time. But time is unidirectional. I can't return to a place I was before, or at least that is sort of the consensus opinion amongst a lot of physicists. There might be some exceptions to this, might actually be quite a few exceptions to this, but that's a completely different story altogether. But one of the most important things is that if you move through time, you actually increase entropy, or a system that moves through time loses information, increases in entropy unless you add energy to it. But that's sort of classical thermodynamics for you. So how I usually try to explain this is that if you have a cup of coffee and you put it in your kitchen and you just leave it there, it cools off. The heat in this cup of coffee dissipates into the environment. but it stays at the same place. So it moves through time, and as it moves through time, it dissipates heat into the environment. But an interesting thing happens at the same time, because as your cup of coffee dissipates heat into the environment, you also lose information about that particular cup of coffee. And you can fairly easily try to imagine this by doing this thought experiment. You put your cup of coffee in the kitchen, put it on a counter, you turn off all the lights so that you can't really see where your cup of coffee is anymore, but then you put on IR goggles so that you can actually see the heat signatures of the stuff that's in your kitchen. Well, then your cup of coffee really blot out quite strongly. So, hey, there's my cup of coffee. But if you leave it there for an hour and cools off, then heat will dissipate into the environment. And if you then put on your IR glasses, then all of a sudden it will be a lot harder to spot your cup of coffee. And if you leave it there overnight, then you come back into your kitchen, put on your IR goggles, you can't see it anymore at all. So over time, you've lost information. So the dissipation of heat into the environment equals a loss of information about the particular objects you're interested in. Now, how does that relate to qualia space? In qualia space, you have the same thing as moving through temporal space. You can't return to a place that you have been before. I can never get into the exact same position where I was before. Probably has to do something with the same processes that drive me through time, namely loss of entropy, or increase of entropy, loss of information. So one of the wild things about this qualia dimension idea is that the qualia dimension and the path that we carved through this qualia dimension is associated with the same thing as what happens if we move through time. We lose information to the environment. So one of the axioms that is part of the idea that we move through qualia space is that an information processing system that moves from experience to experiences dissipates information into the environment. And that's not just by analogy with this cup of coffee that you can argue this, but also by looking at what's actually going on under the hood in information processing systems. So I'm sitting here behind a laptop, watching at my screen. I'm watching at my own image. I'm watching at your image. And I have a conscious sensation of this screen in front of me. However, if you look at the actual processes that are going on in not just my brain, but also in my retina, the moment that a photon emitted by my laptop screen hits my retina, it activates certain proteins, cis-retinol. Cis-retinol sort of falls apart. It activates nerve cells and ganglion cells in the back of my retina. An entire cascade of neural events is happening before I actually become aware of what is on my screen. This awareness of what is on my screen is a moment of consciousness, and that is sort of the aggregation of all that information processing that occurs between the moment that a photon hits the back of my retina and I actually perceive what's going on my screen. And we know actually know that because I did a lot of work myself in my early Ph.D. days, that can take from roughly 1/10 to up to half a second. That's quite a lot of time. And there's quite a lot of information being processed in that particular span of time, and information that I can't really get back. So I mentioned this protein in the back of my retina, cis-retinol. A photon hits that, the protein falls apart, but it gets resynthesized rather quickly. But that's information that's lost from my cognitive system. I don't have access to that information anymore. Now, one of the cool things is that we know that information is a physical thing. We know that since the 1960s, when I always get his first name was either Hans or Rob Landauer, but it's called Landauer's principle. Information is physical, and if you want to erase information, that will generate heat or entropy. So one of the interesting things about moving through qualia space is that every step from one conscious sensation to the next one, there's a lot of information processing going on in between different frames of consciousness. And one of the cool things that we know from cognitive neuroscience is that our transition through qualia space is not smooth, it's discrete. We make jumps of roughly 40 milliseconds, 25 to 40 milliseconds a step. So that's where this 40 hertz hypothesis comes from. So the idea is that
Wow.
we take steps of 25 milliseconds. One frame of consciousness is about, 25 to 40 milliseconds. Sometimes a bit faster, sometimes it's a bit slower, but we know that it's not a smooth path. We know that it's discrete steps that we take, and the information that's being processed between those steps is lost. We perceive some of that, but a lot of the information that is being processed by our brains never reaches consciousness, but nonetheless, we jump from moment to moment in consciousness space. But the information that's unconscious has to go somewhere. We can't destroy that. We can't erase that from our systems. So it has to go somewhere. And that is actually a neuroscientific reason why you can actually state that an information processing system that moves through qualia space has to dissipate that information into its environment. And here is where things get really interesting. We know that some of the information has to get lost in terms of heat. That's Landauer's principle. But those are really tiny amounts of energy, and we can't really pick them up. So I can try to measure the amount of energy that I dissipate because I'm losing unconscious information to the environment, but that's rather minuscule. But even more interesting, if we say that a system moving through qualia space dissipates information or dissipates heat into its environment, that environment is now not just the physical space around it. We also have this qualia space now where a system can lose information. So that's a very speculative thing to say, but if the theory is correct, then we should also find information dissipation from a conscious system into systems that are in its, what you might call, qualia environment. Now, getting back to, this all sounds very vague, but I'm now going to make it a bit more concrete for you. So the cup of coffee on my kitchen counter dissipates its heat, its information into the direct environment. However, a conscious system has a slightly more complex environment. I just gave this example that even though you and I are not physically in the same space, we do share a part of qualia space at the moment because we're talking to each other, we're interacting. So theoretically, that means that the information that I'm now dissipating into the environment is not just ending up here in this office room in the Netherlands, it's also ending up probably somewhere in the part of space that you are occupying. Because of this valve that we have, we now have a connection in qualia space because we occupy sort of the same space. But remember, we're talking about very, very minute physical effects here. The Landauer principle, it's just minute increases of entropy that we get because of information being lost out of our cognitive systems. If you want to measure those, you actually have to set up a rather specific experiment. And one of the things that I have thought of, and one of the experiments I'm actually running at the moment, is if we can come up with a kind of device or setup that functions as what I call it an information sink, analogous to a heat sink. So if I go back to the hot cup of coffee on my kitchen counter and I'm actually watching it with IR goggles, the spread of heat from the cup of coffee into the kitchen is kind of, random. It dissipates into the environment and it dissipates everywhere. But I can kind of steer that dissipation of heat a little bit if I introduce something that's called a heat sink. And a heat sink is an element that you got in gaming computers in order to direct heat away from the CPU. So you can just take a block of aluminum, put that next to the cup of coffee, and that will be the first thing to heat up in the environment once the cup of coffee is starting to dissipate its heat. So if I then put on my IR goggles and my cup of coffee is cooling down, I'll see the block of aluminum heating up because it's absorbing the heat from the cup of coffee. I get heat transfer there. So one of the things that I've been thinking of, and I'm still working on the actual experiments, is to see if we can get an analogous thing, but then in the information realm. Can we create something called an information sink? Now, in order to create that, you need a system that is able to absorb information. Now, one of the things that's capable of absorbing information is a system that has no information whatsoever in it. And we actually have those kinds of devices, and they're called number generators, or actually random number generators. More precisely, quantum random number generators. And these are devices that are being used in cryptography, in online casinos. So there's actually a big market for quantum random number generators. But these devices are theoretically devices that are capable of absorbing information if my model is correct. So if the idea of information dissipation into Q space is correct, then if I put a quantum number generator somewhere in my Q space, in my environment, even though it is not physically next to me, I should be able to pick up some kind of information, some kind of deviation from the normal behavior from a quantum random number generator if I'm engaged with it in some way. Now, and interestingly, this is exactly what about a century of parapsychological research has found, and which you can, I believe, you can actually get a bit of an idea about how to manipulate that. And it's actually quite fascinating. I'm running a couple of experiments at the moment, and in which I'm looking at whether large language models like ChatGPT can actually achieve the same thing. I'm writing that up now, and can give you a little spoiler about that one. It actually appears to work. If I let ChatGPT interact with a quantum number generator and compare that with a pseudo-random number generator, so that's just a random number generator, which is a computer program, you actually get a very strong significant effect, which is a bit shocking because it means that, according to this idea, ChatGPT is conscious. Which is even what might be even more shocking. ChatGPT is able to do psychokinesis. So I'm not sure if I can get this paper published anywhere, but yeah. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there.
And I'd love to. I think it's a perfect time to jump into parapsychology a little bit. Well, maybe a lot of bit. I'd love to have you kind of recount one of the major experiments you did when it comes to, I believe it was the music festival, where you had the random number generator and you're able to show those significant reduction in randomness. Could you explain, I guess, firstly, just for the audience, generally what this experiment is of using a random number generator and what that proves, and then as well that experiment and that event?
Yes. So I think for the audience, it's important to realize what a random number generator actually is. So it's a device that generates a series of ones and zeros. And every 1 or 0 is exactly random. So you have 50% chance of obtaining a 0 or a 1. If you look at the behavior of a random number generator over a longer period of time, it should give you just as many zeros as ones. But at the same time, there should not really be any discernible pattern in there. So there are all kinds of statistical tests that you can carry out in order to make sure that your random number generator is functioning. And it basically comes down at observing the output of your number generators for several minutes, counting the numbers of ones and zeros, checking for patterns, and then see if that still falls within sort of statistical bounds. So we have neatly specified tests in order to test the randomness of these generators. Now, these random number generators come in several implementations. You have number generators based on electrical circuits. You have number generators based on optical circuits. But you also have number generators which are based on computer programs. And the big difference between those two is that the ones that are based on hardware they are based on quantum mechanical processes, and these are fundamentally unpredictable. There is no key, there is no formula that you can use in order to predict the output of these number generators. However, if you look at the computer programs, they need what is called a seed. And a seed is a value that you put into an algorithm, then the algorithm produces a whole series of numbers that actually is completely random, in which there's no structure to be found, unless you actually know the number that you put in there. So even though they appear to be random, they are predetermined. Now, why would you put those number generators at a music festival? Well, that's actually also a fun story. One of the most famous parapsychologists in the world, Dean Radin, has actually done an experiment quite like the one I did at Lowlands, the music festival I went to. He did it at Burning Man, and what he did is he took a bunch of random number generators to Burning Man and looked at the output of the number generators during the moment that, well, the man was actually being sort of put to fire. The moment the Burning Man became Burning Man. Now, obviously, it's a festival at which people are already in a sort of different state of consciousness, and what people very often report when the Burning Man is set afire is that there's some kind of electricity in the air. There is, as Radin called it, a disturbance in the force. So one of the interesting things is that if you look at the output of the number generators during that particular moment, they all of a sudden become a little bit less random. And it's a pattern that has been observed by other researchers in other circumstances as well. So a decrease of randomness in RNGs has been found in poltergeist phenomena, haunted houses, but also by the Global Consciousness Project, which you are probably familiar with. The Global Consciousness Project is basically a network of number generators all around the world. And one of the key findings in the GCP is that these number generators can become more correlated at the moment that there is a significant event in the world. So tonight we have the finale of the Eurovision Song Festival, which is quite a big thing at this side of the pond, and that would be an excellent moment for the GCP to capture these moments of less randomness. So the idea of taking a bunch of number generators to music festivals is not particularly new, but it was an important opportunity for me to A, replicate a classic finding in parapsychology, but B, also try to get a bit of a feeling of what's going on here. So I took my number generators to Lowlands, which is the biggest music festival in the Netherlands. And I basically let them run for 3 days, correlated the output of these number generators with stuff like whether I was giving a lecture or not, whether there were main events on the stages, etc., etc. Now, one of the cool things is if you have a whole set of number generators, because these devices are not that expensive anymore. They are, well, I think you can get a very decent number generator for $80 or so. So I actually had 4. 2 of them are actually plugged in at the festival site itself, and I had one of them directly connected to an app. To actually the Lowlands Musical Festival app, which was the itinerary where people could then actually live check the output of the number generator. So I had one number generator with which people were interacting. They were looking at it and they were trying to influence it with their minds. I had one number generator which was at the site just producing random numbers but doing nothing for the rest. And I had one number generator which was back in Groningen. Where I was then working at the university, but we're also storing those numbers for later analysis. I also had one number generator, which was an algorithmic number generator, so one of these predetermined ones, which was basically a computer program, and people could also interact with that one. So in the app, there are 2 lines, one of a quantum number generator, one of the pseudo-random number generator, And we had a couple of number generators just producing idle numbers, which we were only analyzing after the festival. Now, the idea was, according to the theories of the Global Consciousness Project, or if you look at Radin's interpretation of this idea that consciousness is a field and that is what is disrupting these number generators, my hypothesis was, okay, but then it shouldn't really matter if we are looking at the numbers that people are interacting with via the app or numbers that I am storing on my hard disk, but I'm only going to look at later. If consciousness is some kind of physical phenomenon that interacts with quantum processes, both of these number generators should be disrupted. My number generator in Groningen should be just fine. Of course, the pseudo-random number generator should not be doing anything. However, the pattern of result is a little bit different. What I got was the following pattern. We got a massive effect in the number generator which people were interacting with. So the one that was being presented on the app actually showed a pretty big deviation, and it actually showed the biggest deviation right after the moment I gave a lecture on this experiment and people were actually fiddling with their apps. So the moment that they were interacting with it, we actually had this big effect. Pseudo number generator didn't respond to anything. That was just flat. Now, what was actually quite interesting is that the generator, which was producing output we did not analyze, gave a huge effect, but so large that it could not be true. And I was actually quite happy with this. And the reason for this is it showed that the analysis that we were using was very sensitive because the number generator, the one that was producing the large effect, initially passed the quality checks of the factory where it was produced. And that was a rather simple test, just checking 5 minutes to see if the distributions of ones and zeros was not off. Now, the tests that we were using were quite a bit more sensitive, and it showed that that number generator must actually have an effect because it showed a huge deviation. So we actually had it checked out. It actually turned out it was broken. And that is cool because it means that the effect that we found in the number generator, which people were interacting with, which actually showed, well, I called it a huge effect. It was actually rather modest in statistical terms, but it was significant. But that actually told me, okay, but then that must be a real thing. My rather sensitive analyses picked up something that is subtle, but definitely there. Now, there was also another number generator which we left in Groningen, running at the same time, completely flat, did not respond to anything. So that's interesting. So that tells us that it actually is the interaction with the number generator that does something rather than that consciousness is a field that really messes up random processes. So we have a replication of Radin's results and the Global Consciousness Project results. So yes, interaction with a number generator and looking at it does something with its output, but you actually have to look at it. You actually have to interact and engage with it. And that is what actually produces the effect. So it's not kind of a physical wave or sensation or something that produces an effect in real time. It is actually the interaction with the number generator that produces the effect. And fascinatingly, that fits really nicely with the idea of qualia space, because the moment that I'm interacting with a number generator becomes part of this, well, topology, that is this tiny area in qualia space where I'm at. And it means that I can interact and that I can exchange information with that particular system. So even though I can't really push it towards producing more ones or push it towards producing more zeros, the information that, well, it's kind of leaking from my brain as my brain is jumping from the one place to the other place in consciousness space, that information ends up in the random processes of the number generator, making it less random. And that, of course, is quite fascinating. It doesn't mean that I can influence the material world consciously, but my unconscious mind influences the world around me. So it shows that there is this interaction that's going on. Now, I'm stating this as if it is fact, and I have to be a bit careful with this because it's all still is sort of in the speculative zone.
Sure.
But my empirical work to date, and even the work I just briefly told you about with ChatGPT, all points towards this direction. And I find that very exciting. So it doesn't mean that I can do stuff like conscious manifestation. It doesn't mean that I can consciously think of, I want to win the lottery and now I win it. But it does mean that there might be this qualia space that allows us to interact and exchange information in a way that is so completely alien to our normal understanding of the world. And I find it pretty fascinating.
So I think that brings really a seminal question that it comes to any theory of consciousness is then what role do we have ontologically, even teleologically, as an observer within the universe? Are we simply emitting information just like any other system would in like the random number generator context? What is qualia just this entirely separate dimension and we're sort of here abiding by the laws of physics just like everything else and we don't have necessarily uniqueness to us? Or the opposite? Where would you say you kind of fall in that spectrum, both within your framework or even just your personal intuition on that?
Oh, it's actually pretty interesting question, and I have given this a lot of thought because there are two ways that you can interpret this particular theory. So, in one way, you can say, okay, but this is just all means that we're just passive observers, we're just systems rolling through space, and there's not really that much to it. So that's one way of looking at it. But I like to take a slightly different perspective. So one of the key things that we have and that we feel is the feeling of intention, the feeling of being a self, the feeling of free will, if you may. Now, I can explain that away as being just mere illusions or mere, well, free will is just another feeling and it doesn't really do anything. But one of the interesting things is that the qualia space model, and in particular, if you allow for these interactions between information being emitted and connections between qualia space and actual physical space being real, you get a very interesting dynamic going on there. And the dynamic is this. I have intentions, I feel free will. So if I take this feeling of free will, like I want to get a glass of water in 5 minutes, that actually increases the odds of me getting that glass of water in 5 minutes. And I don't really care about what got me in that position, but now I have this feeling I want a glass of water in 5 minutes, and it changes the odds of me actually getting that glass of water. But for me to get a glass of water means that I need to get my body moving through physical space, through my actual kitchen to get a glass of water. If you think in terms of the qualia space model, what I think is going on is that there is an interaction between qualia space and actual space, and that my position in qualia space is not just a mere passive. It's not just receiving information from XYZ space, not just merely a projection. There's also a back projection, and we know it is there because information from qualia space can influence random number generators. And there is this interaction going on there. So I believe that there might be a process through which qualia space can influence the trajectory of particles in real space. So the density field, the probabilities of where particles will end up in real space changes. And that's not just my body, but it's, of course, also my brain. So my conscious decision, my conscious wanting something actually increases the probability of moving through to another state in qualia space, which is at the same sort of track. I mean, as I now want a glass of water, it's quite unlikely that I'm going to end up with a steak on my plate because I'm thirsty, not hungry. So it's quite likely that I'm going to evolve from state of wanting water to state of drinking water. So we can carve out a trace, and that trace increases the probabilities of a physical system actually moving through that trace. So in that sense, I believe that the model allows for a rather elegant way to give free will a position in a universe that's actually guided by objective, not deterministic. So it doesn't work if in, for example, a Bohmian framework, which is purely deterministic. But if we accept sort of the present consensus, namely that the universe is non-deterministic, then Qualia space gives you a very nice way to conceptualize free will. But it gets even, and maybe this is a step beyond what you might think of scientific or that the audience might be comfortable with, but I'm willing to make it here, given that we are free
Please.
thinkers here. So one other aspect that really got me thinking is, so in qualia space, we have all possible qualia being represented. So from dinosaurs that never evolved to be intelligent, but those proto-qualia are still there, to my own qualia, to the qualia of a housefly. One of the interesting things about the qualia of a housefly is that the time frames which houseflies integrate into conscious experiences are a lot shorter than ours. So one of the reasons that it's very difficult to spot a housefly is that the temporal resolution of a housefly brain is in the order of 1 millisecond or so. I just told you that the temporal resolution of our own brains is in the order of between 25 and 40 milliseconds, sometimes even longer than that. So the moment that you have decided that you want to squat a housefly and have the fly squatter, that fly already had at least 100 frames of consciousness
Wow.
or awareness before you even start moving. So its frame rate is a lot higher. But you can imagine that there might also be organisms or systems with frame rates that are a lot slower, that integrate a lot more information before they get to a conscious moment. I'm sure you have seen these amazing pictures or spattered pictures of sea life or even forests, that if you really speed it up, it actually seems, oh, it's alive. It responds to information. It responds to its external environment. So you can imagine, or might actually be conceivable, that there are organisms or systems that have time frames of integration of information that are far longer than ours. But you can even stretch that to the entire length of the universe. It is conceivable that there are qualia that integrate the entire time frame of the universe, that there is what you might call a final thought at the end of the universe. Of course, this only works if there actually is an end to the universe. And if we end up in heat death, then this doesn't work. But suppose that there is a big crunch. Then you do have sort of this final thought at the end of the universe. And what would that be like? So one of the discussions I had with a friend of mine who is an evangelical Christian, but a very open-minded one, it reminded him immediately that, well, might that be sort of a kind of final thought of God or conception of deity? And I find that an interesting thought of line of reasoning for actually two reasons. So first, what would it be like? Just imagine that you can have a conscious experience that encapsulates all the information, everything that went on during the entire 15 billion plus years that the universe existed. That's mind-boggling, but it's something that I find interesting sort of to keep myself awake with at night. But there's another thing. At that final moment, that final thought of a being, deity, whatever, just like everything else in the universe, every other information processing system, it means that information then is being lost, that information then is being transmitted elsewhere. Now, here we get into the realm of pure speculation, but the direction of time in which that information flows does not need to be unilateral. Suppose that from that final moment, information is being spread back into time. Could it be that we pick up information from that final thought at the end of the universe in our lives today? Now, it's a theoretical possibility, which I like to think about sometimes, but one of the fascinating things about the human brain, I told about random number generators, these quantum random number generators, which are stochastically completely open devices which can receive information. And that's why we get these weird things in the Global Consciousness Project, in the Lowlands Project, in my weird experiments with ChatGPT, and pretty much everything I've done over my career in the past 10 years or so. But the human brain is also an excellent number generator. We are pretty bad at producing random numbers consciously, but if you look at the workings of the human brain, one of the main reasons why brains function so well is that they have an optimum signal to noise ratio. You need to have noise in your brain in order to make it work. So it means that we also have built-in noise generators right here in our minds. And if guys like Temporal and Penrose are correct, and part of this is quantum generated, it means that we have our very own quantum random number generators right in our own skulls. So
Wow.
here is a final thought for you. I believe, and this is purely a belief, this is not stated in fact, this is just pure speculation, but I believe that this information that's all around us, that's emitted by all conscious systems, and whether these conscious systems are the people around you, your pets, your plants, or this final thought at the end of the universe, the information being emitted from these conscious systems is not only finding its way into sort of the general environment. I believe a tiny portion of that might actually pop up in our own minds as well. On one hand, it might be an explanation for stuff like precognitive dreams, telepathy. Maybe, just very, very maybe, it's also, it might pop up as divine inspiration, mystic experiences, or I don't know what. But it's an 100% speculation, but I think it's an interesting one, and it's one that sort of is in the back of my mind, and I would like to explore further in my future scientific work.
Awesome. Jacob, thank you so much for all of your insights today and wisdom and breaking down this whole framework. I feel definitely very much informed on really kind of the ins and outs of your theories. And I think it's, as you said in your paper, an intuition pump. I think it's something that really helps kind of foster that intuition and add kind of these layers of knowledge and different angles of looking at this prism. And I think it's a super beneficial one. So thank you for all the work you do, contributing to the collective consciousness that you do. And thank you, of course, for your time today, Jacob. I truly appreciate it.
Okay, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much, and it was absolutely lovely being here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Take care, Jacob.
Okay, cheers.
All
See
right,
you.
bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Quantum Theory Podcast. If you desire to embark on the path of self-mastery, visit quantumtheorypodcast.com to join a like-minded community of purpose seekers committed to personal growth.